Hello students. So Orwell's second essay, Reflections on Gandhi, that is prescribed for you. We are going to take up this essay in this session. So Orwell, we see, though doesn't see Gandhi as a bad man, but he has some mixed kind of feelings about him. Orwell in this essay, we see, has been able to make Gandhi seem more real to us through his cautious skepticism and well-reasoned arguments. He gives credit to Gandhi where he deserves it, and he also appreciates certain personality traits of his, but at the same time he pinpoints some of his odd habits and hypocrisies. He praises Gandhi's commitment to non-violence and passive resistance, but he refuses to see him in a very simplistic way. He believes that Gandhi no doubt was an enigma. He sees in Gandhi's use of symbols, the symbol of that is his spinning wheel, the charkha that he uses is seen as a symbol, and imagery, that is the image of the appearance that he has of an oriental mystic. So this symbol and this image of his, he sees in Gandhi he sees a very shrewd political myth maker. He believes that Gandhi knew it very well that people are moved by passion and not by reason. So with this kind of an appearance of his, people see him as a mystic and they revere him accordingly. The essay Reflections on Gandhi was first published in January 1949, a year after Gandhi's assassination, in the Partisan Review, which is an influential New York-based American quarterly journal of literary, cultural and political criticism. It was founded in 1934. Orwell was invited in August 1948 by the editor of this journal, William Phillips, to write a book review on Gandhi's autobiography, The Story of My Experiments with Truth, that he readily accepted. The autobiography originally appeared in weekly installments in Gandhi's journal Navjivan. Later, it was translated into English by his secretary Mahadev H. Desai, and it was published in book form in 1927 and 29. The autobiography, it was written in a series of short chapters when Gandhi was in prison. It describes his childhood days, his stay in London as a law student, his years in South Africa, and his life in India after his return until the 1920s. And Gandhi says quite categorically, he says that his aim in the autobiography was to describe the development of his moral and religious beliefs rather than to narrate his own life story. I am not writing the autobiography to please critics, he says. I have spared no pains to give a faithful narrative, to describe truth as it appeared to me, and the exact manner in which I have arrived at it has been my ceaseless effort. That is why my devotion to truth has drawn me into the field of politics, and I can say without the slightest hesitation and yet in all humility that those who say that religion has nothing to do with politics do not know what religion means. So this quote from Gandhi's autobiography is an ample answer to what Orwell questions in his opening lines in this essay. Also, it is interesting that we find coincidentally there was a common affiliation with Motihari of Gandhi and Orwell both. Motihari, that is a rural town in Bihar's Champaran district. It was the birthplace of Orwell and also the stage for Gandhi for his first successful Satyagrah non-cooperation campaign that he started against the oppressive taxes levied by the British government on the indigo farmers in 1917. Through Gandhiji's efforts, these tax hikes and tax collections were cancelled until the famine came to an end. So this is an interesting fact that links Gandhi and Orwell together. So now the essay, we see that Orwell opens his essay with an assertion about saints. Saints should always be judged guilty until they are proved innocent. That is, saints, whether they are, before they are adjudged as saints, they need to be seen or judged whether they are capable enough or they have been rightly ascertained as saints or not. So before they are proved innocent, until they are proved innocent, until we come to know that they really deserve to be called as saints or judged as saints, we should not ascertain them as saints. But the tests that have to be applied to them are not, of course, the same in all cases. In Gandhi's case, the questions one feels inclined to ask are: to what extent was Gandhi moved by vanity? Did he take pride enough in the consciousness of himself as a humble, naked, old man sitting on a praying mat and shaking empires by sheer spiritual power? And to what extent did he compromise his own principles by entering politics? Which of their nature are inseparable from coercion and fraud? So he tries to investigate Gandhi's political means and his political motives. What motive was exactly behind his joining politics? So he acted as an ascetic, saintly figure. He managed to have great political leverage as well, and in these lines Orwell tries to discuss the depth of his saintly authenticity, and he finds it quite consistent and genuine towards the end of the essay. He tries to ascertain that the fact that Gandhi deserved to be a saint. Orwell also tries to investigate the case of Gandhi's saintliness by examining Gandhi's life, his acts and writings in immense detail in the light of his autobiography, and by reconsidering his own earlier thoughts about Gandhi. So before ascertaining him as a saint, he tries to investigate certain points, whether it was fair enough for people to adjudge him as a saint or not. Orwell in this essay explains that British authorities did not consider Gandhi or his pacifist activities as a real threat to their rule. Rather, they viewed him as useful for them. It was also apparent that the British were making use of him. This is what he says in his essay, or thought they were making use of him. Strictly speaking, as a nationalist, he was an enemy. But since in every crisis he would exert himself to prevent violence, which from the British point of view meant preventing any effective action, whatever, he could be regarded as our man because he was against, or he prevented violence. In private, this was sometimes cynically admitted also, that he was on their side. The attitude of the Indian millionaires was similar. So the Britishers and as well as the Indian millionaires both believed it to be so, because these millionaires, because they felt that Gandhi's demand was more appealing, because he demanded of them merely that they reform their attitudes and their spiritual lives, rather than that they give up their wealth, as most of the socialists and communists would have demanded from them. So Gandhi called upon them to repent, and naturally they preferred him to the socialists and communists who, given the chance, would actually have taken their money away. So the gentleness with which he was nearly always handled was due partly to the feeling that he was useful to the Britishers, because he always prevented violence, and this is what the Britishers wanted. He elsewhere also called Gandhi as Britain's right-hand man, and this is why he believes that Gandhi was always treated with such lenience, as the Britishers were always in terror when he used to be in jail that he might die and be replaced by someone who believed less in soul force and more in bombs. But despite these negativities towards Gandhi, he somehow believes in his moral power, and he says that his natural physical courage was really to be acknowledged. It was outstanding, and the manner of his death was a proof of it. He, not safeguarding himself and attaching any significant value to his own skill, speaks a lot about his natural physical courage. Orwell also comments on Gandhi's ordinary looks, his humble origins, and his humility. And he says, and though he came of a poor middle class family, started life rather unfavorably, and was probably of unimpressive physical appearance, he was not afflicted by envy or by the feeling of inferiority. So this was a positive trait in Gandhi's personality. Despite all these shortcomings of his or his humble origins, he was not inflicted with an inferiority complex. The then Viceroy of India, Lord Reading, when he met Gandhi for the first time in 1921, he was not very much impressed by his appearance, and he said that one would not turn a second time to have a look at him. But he was very much impressed by the way he spoke. That is, he also believed that he had an impressive way of speaking. Orwell believes that Gandhi did not pretend to be a saint, and for this he praises him for his honesty in openly confessing his sins and moral failings, and then showing moral strength in abstaining from further sinning. And he writes in the essay, he was not one of those saints who was marked out by their phenomenal piety from childhood onwards. That is, he was not born with a halo over his head. Instead, he led a fairly unremarkable, ordinary kind of a life in respect to his cultural, economic and social conditions. Neither did he denounce the world like many saints after certain sensational debaucheries, certain sensational, passionate trysts. So he makes full confession of the misdeeds of his youth, but in fact there is not much to confess, he says, and there are very small pitfalls that he was involved in. A few cigarettes, a few mouthfuls of meat, a few annas pilfered in childhood from the maidservant, 2 visits to a brothel. On each occasion he got away without doing anything. 1 narrowly escaped lapse with his landlady in Plymouth. 1 outburst of temper. That is about the whole collection. This is all about his sins that one can enumerate. His character was an extraordinarily mixed one, but there was always nothing in it that you can put your finger on and call bad. And I believe that even in Gandhi's worst enemies would admit that he was an interesting and unusual man who enriched the world simply by being alive. and that's why we acknowledge Gandhi and we acknowledge his presence rather. Orwell, at the same time, we see in the essay, is critical of Gandhi's reluctance to compromise with the religious principles and behaving in an inconsiderate way towards his wife and children, denying them the animal food prescribed to them by the doctor. So the doctor had advised them to have chicken broth, otherwise there was danger to their lives. But still, Gandhi would not approve of it. He did not permit them to have it, and he had endangered their lives. And of this, Orwell is critical, and he says that it was an inhuman act on the part of Gandhi. Though it is on record that the threatened death never actually happened, and Orwell, but somehow calls him inhuman. The essence of being human is that one does not seek perfection, that one is sometimes willing to commit sins for the sake of loyalty, that one does not push asceticism to the point where it makes friendly intercourse impossible. No doubt, alcohol, tobacco, and so forth are things that a saint must avoid, but sainthood is also a thing that human beings must avoid. So human beings must first try to be human beings rather than trying to be a saint. Orwell himself, initially, he disapproved of the so-called pacifism, and he considered it as a phenomenon. As a phenomenon, he disapproved of it, and he also questions Gandhi's non-violent approach, and he is doubtful of the fact that if this approach of Gandhi would have been applied in a totalitarian government, it would have been a total failure, and it would not have been possible for Gandhi to continue with his non-violent approach and be successful in a totalitarian government as he was in doing so against the Britishers. Because in a totalitarian state, he says that leaders are almost insane there, and the opponents of the regime, they disappear in the middle of the night and nobody knows about them, and they are never heard of again. But somehow after the Second World War, Orwell, he grew somewhat tolerant of the word pacifism, and in this essay he seems to satisfactorily accept Gandhi's pacifism to some extent. And he says in the essay, however, Gandhi's pacifism can be separated to some extent from his other teachings. Its motive was religious, but he claimed also for it that it was a definitive technique, it was a method capable of producing desired political results as well. Gandhi's attitude was not that of most Western pacifists. Satyagrah, as Gandhi preferred it to be called, first evolved in South Africa. It was a sort of non-violent warfare, a way of defeating the enemy without hurting him. And without feeling or arousing hatred. It entailed such things as civil disobedience, strikes, lying down in front of railway trains, enduring police charges without running away and without hitting back, and the like. So these were some kinds of acts which were termed as non-violent warfare acts and termed as satyagrah. So Gandhi objected to passive resistance as a translation of satyagrah. He disapproved of this translation of satyagrah, passive resistance. Rather, he approved of this. In Gujarati, it seems the word means firmness in the truth. So this was the meaning, this was the translation of satyagrah which Gandhiji approved of. So Orwell feels that Gandhi's method of politics depends on galvanizing public opinion. So he argues that Gandhi's method is not transferable to conditions in which there is no free press or no right of public assembly, namely totalitarian conditions. And Orwell's main goal we see in the essay is to test the universalism of non-violence and to see how and whether it could be effectively deployed outside of Gandhi's specific situations. And he says, no doubt Gandhi was instrumental in driving the British out, but still somehow he questions the role of Gandhi in the Indian struggle for independence also, and he declines to give him the sole credit for it. I have never been able to feel much liking for Gandhi, but I do not feel sure that as a political thinker he was wrong in the main, nor do I believe that his life was a failure. It is curious that when he was assassinated, many of his warmest admirers exclaimed sorrowfully that he had lived just long enough to see his life work in ruins. Because India was engaged in a civil war which had always been foreseen as one of the byproducts of the transfer of power. But it was not in trying to smooth down Hindu-Muslim rivalry that Gandhi had spent his life. His main political objective, the peaceful ending of British rule, this was the main objective of Gandhi, had after all been attained. This was done by a Labour government. So this still the Britishers leaving India and India becoming independent, this the credit of all this also Orwell doesn't want to give fully to Gandhi, and he says this was done by a Labour government, and it is certain that a conservative government, especially a government headed by Churchill, would have acted differently. But if by 1945 there had grown up in Britain a large body of opinion sympathetic to Indian independence, how far was this due to Gandhi's personal influence? So how much credit can we give to Gandhi personally? And if, as may happen, India and Britain finally settle down into a decent and friendly relationship, will this be partly because Gandhi, by keeping up his struggle obstinately and without hatred, disinfected the political air? Was he disinfecting the political air? He questions. That one thinks of asking such questions indicates his stature. But all these questions, when you are putting these questions, these questions are raised, it in itself is indicative of the fact that he had a tall stature. Gandhi did have a tall stature. Orwell, who has a sort of aesthetic distaste for Gandhi, but he doesn't dislike him totally. Rather, he judges him somewhat favorably in the last sentence of the essay. One may feel, as I do, a sort of aesthetic distaste for Gandhi, he says. One may reject the claims of sainthood made on his behalf. He never made any such claim himself, by the way, but still people considered him to be a saint. So one may also reject sainthood as an ideal and therefore feel that Gandhi's basic aims were anti-human and reactionary, but regarded simply as a politician, and compared with the other leading political figures of our time, how clean a smell he has managed to leave behind. So Orwell questions the idea of Gandhi as a saint, and he is highly critical of his strict abidance to extremely inhuman religious principles that ultimately contribute to his saintly image, but still somehow he absolves him of all sins and ultimately admires him for his remarkable political acumen. This unusual ending with an admiration for Gandhi somehow seems quite contrary from mm, how and in what way Orwell began his essay. So this is all for now. Thank you so much.